Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Christy Vogler.
And I'm Colin McCormick.
And today we continue our redux of MWD's Season 1 with Alexander, a 2004 epic historical drama directed by Oliver Stone and starring Colin Farrell, Anthony Hopkins, Angelina Jolie, and many others.
Val Kilmer. Gotta get him in there.
I know, Jared Leto. And to help us rehash this marathon of a film, like literally has an intermission in the middle of it, is a very special guest, Dr. Jenn Finn, who's associate professor and chair of the Department of Classical Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at Loyola University Chicago. She's also author of Contested Past, A Determinist History of Alexander the Great, and contributed to the recent Netflix special, Alexander, the Making of a God. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, guys. I'm happy to be here.
Yay. And I think before we dig into this movie, we were actually really excited to talk to you a little bit about your experience working with Netflix, especially because it had a very strong reaction when it released earlier this year. So can you tell us a little bit about what that was like being involved with it and afterwards as well?
Yeah. This was a really long process, actually. So I think it was in early 2021, maybe late 2021, they started doing some, what I didn't really realize were screen auditions. So we were, doing interviews about Alexander. They were sort of asking some leading questions so you could see a little bit how they were wanting to frame the documentary. But, they gave us, a lot of leeway to say, whatever we really thought as scholars. The people who ended up being involved weren't really aware of each other's involvement, mostly because we had to sign NDAs. So, I didn't really know who was working on the script with them. I was under the impression that ultimately I was going to be on camera, but I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And for a while, so I think I did maybe 3 one-hour interviews with them. Wow. And then for a while I heard nothing. And then, I don't know, I think it might have been like 3 weeks before they wanted to record the expert elements of the docudrama. They emailed and said, can you come to London for 24 hours? And I said, okay, I can come for 24 hours. So I went there and, I had never done anything like that before. So I don't know what my expectations actually were, but we were in this like warehouse, basically. It was pretty dank and cold. I was sitting there in the interview chair with blankets all over my lap and like space heaters surrounding me because it was London, A, and B, I think the budget by that time was pretty much run out. So they didn't get a super fancy place. But you wouldn't know that, by looking, at the interview segments. The whole process, we went through all 6 episodes in one day. It was about 8 hours of interviewing. I brought with me Brian Bosworth's Conquest and Empire just so that I could look up information that I needed if they stumped me with something. They were fine to take multiple takes of things, so it wasn't super. They were great. They were super nice people. There wasn't a ton of pressure on it. I was probably a little bit wooden for their taste in retrospect, but, I had never done it before. I didn't know what I was doing. And as we went along, they had sent me the questions that they wanted to ask me several days ahead of time. But I remember there being something like 28 or 30 pages worth of questions. So it was really difficult to get through all of that. There were some things that I knew I was either not going to be able to speak to, or I didn't think were historically accurate. And so I wasn't going to respond in the way that they wanted me to. In those cases, I just said, ask somebody else, because I knew they had other experts with them. And it was more challenging than expected because they wanted us to pronounce the names a certain way. So, for instance, I've been used to saying Darius III my entire academic career. They wanted me to say Darius. Later on, they actually changed it. So I think Lloyd Llewellyn Jones eventually said, like, oh, you can say it either way. So they covered the bases that way. But while I was there, they were pretty insistent on Darius. So anytime, the mispronunciation would come out of my mouth, we'd have to start again. There were a lot of times where, whatever I said was not simple enough, I guess you could say, for the lay audience. Mm-hmm. So they would want me to rephrase or just cut out sort of technical terminology, anything like that. So it was really exhausting. It felt like teaching an entire course on Alexander the Great in 8 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. It was really hard. They had a history expert with them who had done a ton of research on Alexander, and he was absolutely excellent. The whole crew was amazing. They were really nice people. And I had not seen any of the dramatic footage. The only thing that I knew was that they had filmed for, I think, 6 or 8 weeks in Morocco. And beyond that, I had no idea. I didn't know what the actors looked like. I didn't know what their storyline looked like. I could only surmise from the questions that they had asked me. I didn't even know what the subtitle was going to be. I didn't know they were going to sort of go with the divine thing. Yeah. And so, when it came out at the end of January, it was kind of as much of a surprise to me as it was to everybody else. I didn't know how much of my commentary they were going to use, if at all. I was actually a bit concerned that they weren't going to use any of it. So I was pleased to see that I showed up at least in the first episode. And then I was like, okay, well, I can take my time watching the rest of this. But, I actually thought they did a pretty good job with it. I thought it was entertaining.
Yeah.
I thought that the 6th episode was a little bit rushed and sort of hacked together more than the others. Mm-hmm. And I know, I think it's pretty clear if you know anything about Alexander, or if you were in that studio with us, that they're leaving the door open for a second season. So, I think they can do a great job with that. I think they had great production quality. I thought the acting was great. The storyline, they took their liberties. I know that part of their goal was to try to give more attention to the Persian perspective of things than has been traditionally done. I don't really know that that's possible, because we don't have sources for that. So it's difficult to do that. But, I thought it was entertaining. I did not anticipate that it was going to have the reaction from the right wing that it did.
Yeah.
Maybe that was naive. I think that was probably naive on my part. It's one of those things where if you study Alexander or you study the ancient world, sexuality is not really a thing you think about because it's just, they didn't think about it. Mm-hmm. So, I've been trained to understand that it's not an important aspect of their identity and thought. I mean, they all just kind of consorted with everyone, including the great conquerors of the world. But apparently, for the right wing, that's not okay, particularly with respect to their hero and savior, Alexander the Great.
Yeah, so, if he's a military genius, he's obviously straight. Like that's just what it is.
Clearly, yeah. And I think several kind of unfortunate things occurred at the same time. One of them was that the first time I appear on the show happens to be the moment at which Hephaestion and Alexander start making out, which when I first saw it, I didn't think anything of it. I was like, oh, okay, it's my turn to talk now. But actually, I think that even though I say nothing about their relationship in that way, I became automatically sort of associated with their sexual relationship because I asked the other contributors to the documentary whether they were harassed in the same way that I was about this, and no one else was.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. I have a theory that it has to do with A, the point at which I first appear, and B, the fact that I am one of the only American-based women on the show. Mm-hmm. And this is where, a lot of that stuff becomes a large topic of dialogue. So I had people, before I figured out how to make my Instagram private, I had a lot of people sending me hate messages about how I was glorifying a murderer. I had someone call my office at work 4 or 5 times in a row, email me, email people who are associated with the chairpersonship before me, to demand that I provide evidence for the idea that Alexander was gay and substantiate my so-called claim, which of course I never made, that Alexander was gay. And the whole thing was just shocking to me. I couldn't believe it because, A, this doesn't cross my mind at all. And B, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm sorry you had to go through that, because that's like, it's so weird, because one of the big conversations we have in academia all the time, of course, is like, how do we engage with a broader audience? And Netflix is one great way to do that. YouTube, space, all of those kinds of spaces are great to do that, but it's also really difficult to do that because it's I've read some of the reviews for the Netflix, and it is astounding. I'll go ahead and read one really quick. For this is for the Netflix series. One reviewer wrote, with multiple misspellings, not a spoiler, highly inaccurate series. I agree with another review saying that the 300 movie was more accurate than this. So many missed moments, missed battles, inaccurate events, oh so many. It felt like watching something like Ancient Aliens, like this is a hypothesis of a couple of PhDs. Only reason I put 4 stars is for the drama series, not the historians nor the highly inaccurate story.
The reviewers really telling on themselves right there.
They are. And a lot of the reviews were very similar in that, like, they have bought into the Alexander fantasy of military genius leader, and they don't actually care about the man himself in a lot of ways, which to me is more like, he is such a fascinating person.
Yeah, I read a lot of those IMDb reviews at the beginning, and it was really fascinating to me because it fell into 2 camps. Mm-hmm. It was the nationalist camp, where the people would insist, this is a horrible series. Alexander's Macedonian. He's not Greek. They don't know what they're talking about. And then the people who wanted to be upset about the Hephaestion, relationship. But there was really no in between. There was no objective, decision making among any of these groups about what they thought about the docudrama part of it. It was just those 2 issues that they were really fixated on.
And I can say for myself that I did really enjoy it. I liked that it was doing a lot of the story that is, I thought it was interesting, that is absent from the movie we're going to talk about.
Yes. Because I was going to say the same thing, because I didn't realize this until the second time I watched the 2004 movie. But the first half of the campaign is just not covered at all.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they do in the Netflix series. So they actually serve each other well, but you'd have to have a lot of patience to go through both.
Which is what I did in the last 24 hours.
Kudos to you.
I love that they included the Gordian knot, though. I'm like, yes, that is a nerd moment right there for me.
Yes,
but it was also, important. And yeah, and some other review I read was actually really astute. It's like, Netflix had to bring up the Hephaestion relationship because, like, to get that crowd, they framed it as like that. But it's like, but obviously most people didn't get past episode 1 because they never bring it up again. I'm like, yeah, they never bring it up again. Like, so it's very weird, because you're right, they just didn't think about their sexuality in that way. And let's be serious, most very rich people probably have much more fluid sexualities than the majority of the audience watching the show. So.
Well, and also later military generals that were not living in the ancient world, that they would prefer not to think about as having fluid sexual identities too. Mm-hmm. So Alexander was just the first in many of these famous people that would have engaged in sort of pansexual behavior. And it's just, they would not have thought about it. It just did not define them in the same way that it defines people in our culture. So, just the demand for evidence to that effect was just, the whole thing was silly, so I didn't respond. But they found something else to be upset about and moved on pretty
Always.
quickly. Yeah.
Well, I guess that brings us to our main question then, is going to the Alexander movie from 2004. We want to know, what is your personal history with it? Like, if you remember watching it, and after reflection, do you dig it?
Okay, so I will say I kind of have an interesting history with this movie because I knew that it came out. I was an undergrad as a classical civilization and Latin major at Michigan, but I hadn't really studied Alexander the Great at all. I thought I was going to be like a Roman Republican historian. I really hadn't had any encounter with Alexander the Great. But I had heard rumors that the movie was insufferably boring. And so I decided that it behooved me as a classicist to watch it, but I needed to watch it under special conditions. And so it just so happened that summer I was getting my wisdom teeth out. And so I
Ooh.
thought, so I figured, what better time to watch an insufferably boring movie than when I'm hopped up on something and I can't really go anywhere.
Mhm.
So I remember feeling like the critics were correct, that this is a very boring movie. But that was at a time when I didn't know very much about Alexander. And I think that my opinion about it is different now. So I don't know if you guys are cool with people waffling a little bit.
All the time.
Yeah, I was
Okay.
gonna say. I was actually really hoping you were gonna say I freaking dig this movie, 5 stars all the way, because it's always a lot of fun when we have a champion. It creates a good dynamic, right? It's like WWE logic, right? You need a heel and a hero. But yeah,
Well,
people waffle all the time.
I can't say that I loved it, but I also don't think it deserves the derision that it's received. So I've been thinking a lot about this, actually. We don't know anything really about Alexander. All of our sources about him are much later
Mhm.
than he is. Although, yeah, they may derive from contemporaries. They've definitely been doctored, through Roman sources. And I've really come to believe over time that anybody who writes or thinks or talks about Alexander really has their own version of him. And that's rightly so. I mean, everyone is entitled to have their own version of Alexander. And I think what we see in this film is Oliver Stone's version of Alexander. And he's totally entitled to have that version. And I'm happy to entertain, everybody's version of Alexander, so I don't think that it's the most entertaining movie in the world. Every time I think about it, it makes me upset because the acting is so bad. And the accents are so bad. And there are so many things that are bad. But ultimately, there is a consistent storyline that Oliver Stone wanted to impart to his audience. And I think he was successful in doing that. So I'm not going to take his vision away from him. So it was okay, is my answer.
This, I guess, leads to an important question, which is what was the version that everybody watched? Because there's 4 cuts of this movie out there. There's
That's
a theatrical cut, there's a director's cut, and a theatrical cut, and then 3 different director's cuts.
I think I did the ultimate cut last night. I think I've seen a few different versions, but last night I did.
I guess my question, because I watched the ultimate cut, which I think is the latest one, but is the first, what is the, I guess because in the version I watched, the very first sort of set piece is Gaugamela.
Yep.
Yes, same.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So it was the ultimate cut then that we all watched.
I think so, yeah. Because I think there's a different, this leads to, I have a question about editing later, but we can put a pin in that for now.
Yeah. So Colin, I didn't get a chance to listen to the podcast that you and Lige did on this.
I've been deleting them. Yes.
I know. I'm like, no, I was going to do my research.
Because I've been trying to get them. I've been trying to get our old episodes that in our original versions back when it was just me and Eli a couple of years ago with much crappier microphones. I don't think my opinion on this movie has changed tremendously. I still find it to be a very hard to watch movie. I had to do it in 2 sittings. this time, I find myself sort of struggling with questions of like, who is this movie for? And really just like, what is this movie trying to say, like about Alexander, about war in the Middle East, circa 2004, right? About American geopolitics or global relations or anything like that. And I'm sort of also thinking, as I was watching it this time, really, because we just had a conversation with Joel Christensen about Troy, and then really like on this review, really viewing Troy, which came out just that same year, through the lens of Bush era Iraq war, American sort of involvement in the Middle East. And that was, again, very prevalent because this is Oliver Stone, right? He's a very politically charged director. He's got thoughts on war and politics and things like that. And so that was kind of the newest lens I was looking at it through, but I still found myself really struggling with, why is every scene Colin Farrell screaming and crying and blubbering? And like, is this a convincing, like, is it like, what is this movie trying to say about him? And really like the thing I struggled with was, what is the narrative of this movie? Because it starts and ends in, well, I don't know. In some ways, it sort of starts and ends with his death, which makes a certain degree of sense. But starting at Gaugamela, with a very, very long, 30-minute set piece battle as your first thing. And I guess like sort of the real question I have, kind of to Jen's point, is like, for general movie going audiences, I have maybe the hindrance or the benefit of at least knowing a little bit of the context of what I'm looking at. And if I didn't have any of that, would this just be completely inscrutable?
Yeah,
Yes.
I was going to say, it feels like that opening scene, my initial thought was, I've had actually students take that scene and review it for like in class to like compare to the records and stuff. And a lot of the times they're former veterans or like military students. And so like, in terms of the historicity of that battle, like we even talked to Rule about this, of like, that is probably one of the best examples in film of an ancient battle. So like, if you are military history buff, that first 30 minutes is definitely for you. It is not for me at all. But then, what's interesting is this movie later ran into the same problem that the Netflix series did, that like initially there were 25 Greek lawyers threatened to file a lawsuit against Stone and Warner Brothers because of the depiction of his relationship with Hephaestion. And even then, as Lige pointed out, she was very upset about, they never actually kiss even.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just
I thought they did. I had completely headcanon that had
their
happened.
Faces get close together, but
so close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
it's like one of those optical illusions where they show you a picture, and it's like a picture of a Coke can, and you're like, there's actually no red in this picture at all. It's just by using green and blue and gray and putting them next to each other, you think there's red or something. And I think that was that. Like, I think in my brain, I just assumed Colin Farrell and Jared Leto kissed, but they didn't.
Well, and the funny thing is like upon the lawyers' viewing of the film, they're like, yeah, we'll take back the lawsuit. It's kind of hilarious to think that film had the same, and Oliver Stone blames that for like why it bombed in the box office. Apparently, I don't think that was the reason, because like both of you said, these films are always fun to watch when you are knowledgeable about the history and you want to unpack it a half hour at a time or so. But man, is it really boring to sit through.
I think it's a burden. I think it's like a curse. Like, I almost wish, like, as it becomes a puzzle. But I think this movie it's a thing I love, which is when a film becomes a perfect metaphor for itself, where it just becomes this long slog with no visible endpoint in sight, and everybody just gets tired and gives up. And Oliver Stone is Alexander, trying to be like, no, I promise, it's just there over the horizon. Like, you just got to dream hard enough with me, and it's our fault for not dreaming hard enough to like see whatever his grand vision is. And like, the failure is on us for not sharing this vision.
I mean, the intermission must be to prevent the mutiny of the audience, right?
Yeah,
I was like, this film even has an intermission. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah, I mean, I tried as a historian to look for the positive things. They start out from Ptolemy's perspective, which is actually perfect
Mhm.
because that's where we get the so-called official tradition of Alexander scholarship is from Arrian, who uses Ptolemy and Aristobulus as his sources. So although these dialogue, or rather I should say monologues of Ptolemy's at Alexandria are something.
A podcast I listened to would put this in a winning category for their own personal Oscar for Putters and Murmurs. And Anthony Hopkins is putting in a real Putters and Murmurs performance here.
Yeah, it's rough. I mean, there are a lot of people in this movie who have seen better days.
Mhm.
I was really disappointed in Jared Leto because in my teenage mind, he is always going to be in My So-Called Life. And that's all he is. He is the heartthrob in My So-Called Life, and he just couldn't pull off the heartthrob in this movie. So I was sad, particularly about him. And then, of course, there's Angelina Jolie, who is a whole different story in this movie.
I was surprised to catch a cameo from Brian Blessed, who shows up
Yep.
as the wrestling trainer, basically to just give his
Yep.
like one scene. That was a pull.
Jonathan Rhys Meyers as Cassander.
Hmm. A lot of early 2000s Pretty Boys.
Yeah.
This is really a bounty, right? Cup runneth over for that kind of thing.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, they have an embarrassment of riches to work with
That's
here.
the phrase I was looking for.
Yeah, and it just didn't work. I mean, there are so many problems, I mean, I don't think an hour and a half can do this justice, unfortunately, but the accents are special, if you want to call it that.
I was like, because we talk a lot about the choice of language used and like Spartacus or things like that. And I'm like, was this an active choice to be like, Macedonians are not Greek in how we think about Greek, like Attic Greek, and therefore we're going, instead of English accents, because that's what all the older Greek movies use, we're going to go Scottish.
Like
or
if Christopher Plummer is supposed to be your Athenian, right, Attic dialect, then the Scottish and Irish brogues are the Macedonian Doric or something like that.
That was my only thought, that it's like, maybe that's what they were going for. I don't know if that's how it landed.
Christy, we didn't hear from you. Do you dig it?
No, I don't. What I said earlier is like, I think it is a really interesting film to like do small pieces of or do in discussion. And I think that kind of reflects my actual history of it. Because unlike 300 or Troy, I didn't see this in theaters. I saw it as part of that Sword and Sandal film class I took as an undergrad. So I've always had to kind of look at it in this more like critical, historical film lens, and not for like, would I go sit in a theater and pay money to sit down and for 3 hours to watch this? And the answer was no. Would I do it for 3 credits at college? Yes, because that was better than writing an essay half the time. Well, I mean, we all write a lot, but it was a nice change of pace. And I think I was glad I saw that film, though, because I studied abroad in Greece next year, and I decided one of the classes I took was Ancient Macedon to Alexander the Great. So I had this film as a basis, and then actually getting to take a class exploring the history. And in fact, my professor was a student of, what's his name?
Robert Lynn Fox.
Yeah, was a student of his. And so he had stories about him to talk about as well. So it was kind of like full circle. But my thing was, and what I probably got from my professor was like, you know what? Alexander gets all of this attention and no one talks about Philip. Philip is awesome. I mean, he's problematic, sure, but like he is also really cool, historically speaking. And he set up so much for Alexander, and that just kind of gets brushed aside in this movie in particular as a drunk, doddering fool, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Colin, did you tell us what you think about it?
I don't dig it, but to that point, I wonder if it kind of falls into the trap that recently I rewatched Walk the Line, the Johnny Cash biopic, with someone who was not a Johnny Cash fan or didn't really know Johnny Cash's music at all. And that's a movie that kind of shows Johnny Cash in all of his worst points, right? As like a womanizer and an addict and an abuser. And then they finish the movie and they're like, Johnny Cash sucks. Like, why do because the movie is sort of banking on you already knowing and liking Johnny Cash. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if this movie does the same thing, where it's like, we've taken for granted that Alexander rules. And so we're going to show him in his worst moments, in the worst possible ways, maybe.
That's what I like to think is part of Stone's vision, that Alexander is just as human as all the rest of us. I mean, he really does spend a lot of time, like you say, crying or having animalistic sex or doing things that are very human. So I think what he's trying to do is show that Alexander is very much like the rest of us, actually, that he has, a desire and an ambition that may outdo any ambition that we may have. But at the core of it, he's really just another person.
Yeah. I was going to say that's why I kind of liked the speech he gave towards the end of his death to Bagorius. I forget his name.
Bagoas.
Bagoas says, like, you gave me like some of the happiest years of my life. And Alexander is lying there and has to think, what is happiness? What have I been doing this whole time? Because, yeah, it's a very different to seek glory to the extent that he does versus I liked that what Ptolemy brings this in too, of just like, we consented by silence, like we followed him, right?
Yeah.
Like he was the big dreamer, but we all went along for the ride because we were in for kind of the material things about it. But at the end of the day, like that's kind of the biggest thing about Alexander is he did all of this and died suddenly and didn't really seem to have a game plan for it.
This is kind of my thing is like, it's like Bago is saying you gave me the happiest years of my life. I was like, I cannot believe that because that is not congruous with anything I've just seen in the last 3.5 hours, right? Like, I don't understand why we're supposed to like this guy aside of like, we are told of all of these, we're told that he's done all of these things, but we never see it. And there's a show versus tell sort of imbalance here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I guess there is a lot of sort of villainization of him, particularly from the Macedonian side. So they're very upset, for instance, that he doesn't produce an heir for them. They're very upset that he seems to be bowing to Persian custom. They show the sort of mutiny against Alexander's further ambition to the east. And I think that's partly because we only see the second half of the campaign. So everybody's pretty excited and willing to siege places and plunder them and take on native women and found cities, etc. in the first half of the campaign, and you miss that. I mean, there are a lot of allusions to the first half of the campaign that would have been really useful. So in the death scene with Clytus, there's a lot of talk about how Alexander wants everybody to envision him as a god, but you don't see anything about him going to Siwa and getting this, pronunciation of being a god from the oracle there. So there's a lot missing, not only as background, but also you're really sort of getting the second half where everybody's tired. So they're going to be upset. But I think at first, a lot of the generals, even Philip's older guard, were happy to be there. So it's and that might have, again, been an artistic choice that he wanted to show sort of the degradation of humanity in the guise of this famous soldier. And the best way to do that was just to start when things got bad.
Yeah, because I guess that was going to be my first question, which I think we kind of started answering, right? Which is this movie makes an interesting choice of, right? Because Alexander, one of the problems with a historical biopic like this is like, there's too much, right? There's just, if you just laid out on a line, Post-it notes or something of everything Alexander did or was said to have done, there's no way it would be 30 hours long, right?
Impossible.
It would be and so choices have to be made, right? It has to tell just one fraction of his story, and so it's still, I think, kind of in a very Alexandrian fashion, bites off more than it can chew. But it starts with what I feel like in another movie would probably be the climax of the movie, right? His big victory at Gaugamela. That's when he overcomes the Persian Empire. That's when he basically becomes king of the world. And then it goes into his journeys further east and eventual, like his army basically kind of mutiny, turning on him.
It basically needs to be a Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I would really like to start with a young Alexander because there's some in Philip's court and like his relationship with his father. And I always joke, it's like Alexander is one of those rare examples of somebody who has both mommy and daddy issues because
rare, you say.
Fair. But like there's so much, and then you also leave out the Battle of Heronia and like the politics that's happening in Greece at the time and how they are viewed as outsiders. So, and this weird reversal of Olympias being the barbarian in the court of Philip and things like that. And it's like, you don't actually understand that. And I think that is so interesting of itself. It's like, can we just have a movie up until like the assassination of Philip? Because I think that would be really cool. And then, yeah, maybe you just have to like piecemeal it.
In addition to also this kind of choice to sort of start at Gaugamela and end at, I guess, Hydaspes, you also have the intercuts back in time, which is the parts I think that frustrated me most, because it really kind of felt that like I couldn't tell why stuff was happening sort of when it seemed like a lot of those could have gone in any order, like why Philip's murder is held off until towards the very end of the film, all of the different scenes with his mother and setting up his whole complicated, fraught relationship with his parents.
Yeah. It feels kind of like a failed example of Witcher season 1, because like that one played with timelines, but intentionally in a way that unless you've read the books, you wouldn't actually realize it's 3 different timelines happening, but each timeline informed the next one in some way because it's providing historical context, right? I think that's what the film was trying to do, but I think you're right. It wasn't always precise. And
you get the parts where it's like him becoming his dad, basically, right? The way like him and Roxana is like Philip and Olympias, like these parallels that the movie is not subtle about.
Like him taming Bucephalus, and then why does that happen there and not necessarily at his final battle with in India?
Yeah.
I love Bucephalus, but
I do too. I was so like, honestly, the most heart-wrenching moment for me is his death.
Yeah.
Hephaestion's death? No. Bucephalus's death? It gets me so much.
Yeah, I mean, Stone definitely wanted to sort of highlight the mommy and daddy part of it, which I would say might be, besides this emphasis on the unity of mankind theme, his creative input showing the most clearly. Because I just have trouble imagining Alexander sort of going on his campaigns and like seeing visions of his dead father in the mountains and stuff the way that it shows here. We do have, pretty good evidence that he's thinking about his dad and how to appeal to the Macedonian soldiery, and this idea that he might have been involved in his father's murder does sort of hang around with him as he goes on his campaigns. It was a little bit overdone for me, but at the same time, that's creative liberty, right? Because I don't think that Ptolemy and Aristobulus are going to say to us, oh yeah, Alexander had a really bad dream last night about his dad. I mean, those are not the things that help them move their own careers along. And, they want to talk about the battles in which they starred, and we're not going to get that kind of information. So that's where Stone comes through, I think. And again, like I said, I think it's fine to make that assumption just based on some of the more subtle portions of our sources that seem to agree that Alexander was always kind of looking back to his dad, but I don't know if he was necessarily haunted by him. It seems to me that it was more of a propaganda tool that he was really trying to squeeze as much out of as he could until it wasn't going to work anymore. But like I said, I'm trying to give Oliver his Alexander. So
yeah.
One of the things that I asked sort of at the beginning, like one of the questions I ponder over is, what is this movie about? And one of the answers I came to is that this movie is about Alexander's relations, right? His relations with his generals, his relationship with his parents, his relationship with his horse, in addition to the many other things this movie is about.
Yeah.
But yeah, and really just that focus on the various sort of triangulating relationships of like him, Hephaestion, his mother, Philip, Cleitus, right? The older generals, the younger generals, Aristotle.
Yeah.
Bagoas, all these
Roxana,
all these people. Roxana, right? Which my other new revelation is that is Roxana just like an Oedipal thing, right? Is the reason he married Roxana because she reminds him of his mother?
Well, that's what Stone wants you to think, right?
Yeah.
But I think that the idea behind all of that is that none of his relationships were uncomplicated, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't define him as a guy with mommy issues because he was a guy with mommy and daddy issues. You couldn't define him, as somebody who was in love with eunuchs because he was in love with eunuchs and men and women from different cultures from his own culture. I mean, he was so complicated, and maybe the whole point is that it takes a complex individual like that to do the things that he did.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's part of the point behind it. But you're right. I mean, the relationships are so entangled with each other that they're almost inseparable. You just don't know where he is at any given time.
And I think that's something admirable to say about this movie, because it is about the relationships. And I think what's problematic about it is that there's so many relationships they're trying to unpack. There's just not enough time to develop any as complex as it should be. And I think that's also why there's such this huge backlash against these depictions of Alexander that do focus on the relationships he's created with different people, is because at the end of the day, a lot of people want it to simply be he's a military genius, and that does not require any interactions with other people. It just is something supposedly he's born with. And I'm like, that is not, you can win a battle, but you can't build an empire with just military strategy.
I mean, it's also diplomatic.
Yeah.
Just like his father. I mean, his father, I read somewhere that someone was very upset that all 7 of Philip's wives don't show up, in the movie. But Alexander does follow in his father's footsteps. He marries several different wives to make political alliances. That's what the Macedonian kings had done. I mean, that wasn't different. I mean, he, in a lot of ways, I think we talk a lot about how great Alexander was and how weak his enemy was. I think, scholars have done a really good job of dispelling the myth that Darius III was some kind of coward or a weak or effeminate king. He was really just acting in the same way that every Achaemenid king before him had acted, in the same way that Alexander was acting, the same way that every Macedonian king before him had acted. So really, when it comes down to it, Alexander defeated Darius III because he was simply a better military general, but he wasn't a different kind of human than Darius III. And I also, Darius III really wasn't incompetent as a general. And I think that also plays to the greatness of Alexander because, Darius was not stupid. He adapted to Alexander's military action as the campaign was going on. He watched what the Macedonians were doing and mitigated danger for his own army in response to that. And he was still outgeneraled. So there was nothing wrong with Darius III. Alexander was really just that good. But he was also just very human.
Yeah, and I think that brings us back to the historical context for the film itself being post 9/11 is that I just think of the speech given by Alexander before Gaugamela really takes place, in this whole premise of they're his slaves. I'm not saying it's very funny to think of Macedonia as talking about we're army made up of free people and whatnot, when that's just not the case in the same way, but same as what 300 did, of how they frame it, of this is led by free men. And
I think there's kind of two things going on, because it's that Gaugamela, the framing, the music, a speech like that, it feels like the sort of strain between the movie that Oliver Stone, I think, wants to make and the movie that maybe studios or audiences expect, where that speech feels like a Braveheart or a Gladiator speech, right? That whole Gaugamela scene is the longer, nerdier, actually version of the first Gladiator battle, right? Where it's actually they couldn't do X, Y, and Z, and these people would be over here, and the army would be organized like this, et cetera, et cetera. But, it has that triumphal ring, but, it's in the first 10 minutes of the movie, and you're like, wait, who, what is what's happening? Who's who? But then, right, what Oliver Stone is trying to develop is Alexander grows on this issue, right? Because later he's chastising the older Macedonian generals for their jingoism or their sort of recalcitrance or their reluctance to adopt or to change, and they're stuck in their ways. And he's like, we're in this new world. There's all these people, and we got to learn and grow. And Alexander kind of goes that way. And then some of the older generals just think he's losing his mind, or it's all going to his head, or whatever it is.
Yeah. It felt very conflicted in that message at times and you kind of understand why for the time the film came out, but because yeah, at the end of the day it's Alexander was also a visionary in a lot of ways. Like he wanted to create cosmopolitan empire of like, and that's something also again that Philip should get some credit for because Philip saw how important working with other city states was to gain an education for his son and his companions, and the sense of like we are going to shine brighter together than if we just stay in our own little corner of the map. And that's such a more positive message than you tend to get from films that are about military leaders or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, the pre-battle speech is like a programmatic part of a battle in antiquity, right? So it's not ahistorical to include something like that. What he said exactly, that's going to be made up in the sources, obviously. I realized actually during that part of the movie very early on, in my second watching of it, that it would be best for me to turn on the captions.
Mm-hmm.
Because in that battle scene, and then actually later, there is it's really a dichotomy of things. You're either mumbling or you're screaming.
Yeah.
To the point where I felt like I was at a heavy metal concert and I really did need to turn on the captions or I wasn't going to understand what was being said. And that actually enhanced my experience because then I caught everything. And sometimes in the midst of battle, they would make these references that you really couldn't catch if you were a layperson in the audience with no background in Alexander. It just wasn't going to happen for you. And even as a historian, sometimes I was like, oh, what did he just say that person's name? Was he talking about vengeance for something? So I suggest to increase your entertainment, you should turn on the captions next time. I know, Colin, you're going to race to watch it again.
I wonder if you could put
that
battle like in front, like take somebody who had, knew a complete blank slate, knew nothing about Alexander or ancient military history or anything. If you put him down and like make him watch that scene and you could be like, okay, like how did Alexander win? And then like what they would say.
They would say charisma, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and like, it's weird because in some ways he's almost a Nepo baby, but they're also working really hard to show that. But like he is the people because part of this opening speech is him calling out people by name and recounting like their victories or brothers or fathers lost or things like that. So he has this personal connection with these men because he's been amongst them. And it's also weird. You forget it's like he is a king. Like this is not how we think, because we always kind of focus on Athens and we've been thinking about Rome so much. It's like to have a king be in a leadership position is very normal for this time period, but not about Greece necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah. Macedon was kind of, as I understood it, they're kind of old school in that way, or even like archaic in some way to have these like patriarchal lineages of kings with multiple wives, right? That feels like something from a bygone or a different era entirely.
They're almost more Homeric in a lot of ways too because of that. So
yeah, they bond through hunting and battle and I mean, and that's the part of the reason why they're such good generals. So yeah, I mean, he may have well known all of those people. I mean, that's the whole idea behind the companions and the friends at court, is that they know each other and they fight better because they know each other. So, the speech was really long. It was probably unnecessarily long, but, it does give you sort of this idea of how things go, before an ancient battle, how you get people who, I mean, they show one of the soldiers sort of urinating himself, right? I mean, this is real stuff. They would do that if they were fearful before battle. I mean, they are facing a massive army with chariots and, scythed chariots and all sorts of things that would be frightening for kids in a foreign land. So, to show that kind of leadership and charisma, would have been even more important than it is now, probably.
To me, that's also where the movie felt the most Oliver Stoney, is right immediately after the battle, where you cut to the doctor's tent and he's there with the soldier, kind of talking the soldier through. Like that feels like a scene from Platoon.
Mm-hmm.
And, talking the soldier through his last moments. Yeah. And I think really one of my problems with this movie is like, we don't get enough scenes like that of like, that guy is like, I understand now why these guys are so ride or die that we would march 10,000 miles all the way to Pakistan for this dude. Over 10 years. The movie, I think, falls victim to wanting to the drunken rampages and the killing Clytus, which is important, but every scene is like dialed up to 11 like that. In a way that it starts to become like white noise. Very rarely in this movie do any two characters just like talk like normal people with one another, or just like sit down and kind of have a normal conversation. They're always blowing off at the hilt or at the verge of blows, or accusing each other of treason, or calling out for exile or banishment. Well,
except for Hephaestion. He has those good conversations with Hephaestion. I think too, though, besides all of the fighting and the blowing up at people and being super drunk, he is also, as you said before, blubbering a lot. But for me, I think that is Oliver Stone's version of the sort of Homeric Alexander, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't give us Alexander at Troy, but he does give us the Alexander who thinks that he's Achilles, right? But unless you have the sort of background for that, then you can't know that that's perhaps why he's being depicted that way.
There's a ton of myth in this film, right? There's the whole cave scene where Philip leads him down. I mean, you should make it a drinking game every time they cut to that picture of Achilles dragging Hector, right?
Yeah.
One of the sort of theses is Alexander's obsession with mythology and myth making, and being like, well, I'm better than Hercules or Dionysus or Achilles and all of these people, and like trying to like put himself in these larger than like he becomes a larger than life person by trying to be a larger than life person, i.e. a myth.
I like how they actually incorporate myth into this, because they are very much using it to inform their own understanding of the world. Like when they get to the Hindu Kush and they talk about Prometheus, and supposedly in one of the caves over there, you'll find the eagle. And I liked that part, because it does show that, like, mythology is oral history in some ways that's meant to give information about the world that people, for the most part, never see. And I think that's one of the moments I like, is that Hindu Kush, because it does take a moment in the film to just show us like, how many just random Greek guys. Sure, so.
And their wives and lovers and cooks and carpenters and slaves and everything, right? It's a whole, I liked the point of where he says it's like a mobile empire, right? It's like it's a city basically, like on the move. It's an entire economy and ecosystem all rolled into one.
Yeah, and I actually loved Aristotle in this movie, because, he imparts that mythological knowledge along with Philip to Alexander, and he kind of puts Alexander in his place. He's like, you're not going to be that awesome. Just calm down and just take a minute to think about the way things are. Aristotle is a really sort of calming force for this kid who you can already see has some fire under his butt and it might not go the right way. And he comes up again and again, throughout the movie as this, like, sometimes Alexander brings him up again to say, oh, well, Aristotle was wrong about this. But then we sort of find out in the end that Aristotle was never really wrong about anything. So I liked him as a thread that is drawn through the movie as this force to bring everything back down to earth.
Yeah, so part of that study abroad trip is we got to go on field trips, and we went to Regina. And we got to go to the supposed area where Aristotle trained Alexander and his ilk. And I'm like, this is so cool. So that always ends up being one of my favorite scenes, because it brings back that memory for me. And I think that's overall, I like the scenes of younger Alexander, played by, I forget, but he
I've got it right here. There's two.
If you watch the original Gossip Girl, he was Eric.
There's Jesse Cam and Connor Paolo are the two.
I think he's the younger one.
Connor Paolo is young Alexander.
Yeah. So I always like the younger stuff. And I think that's why I'm really pitching this. Like, I want a young Alexander movie pretty badly.
I mean, that's just it, right? Is like, I kind of said, like, I'm sticking to my thesis. This movie is a metaphor for itself, but it's like, there's like 6 movies in this movie, right? There's the youth of Alexander, his whole relationship with Aristotle. That's a thing in and of itself. His relationship with each of his parents is possibly its own kind of thread, right? His relationship with Hephaestion, or right, any number of these things. And that, like, I think Roger Ebert in his review said something to the effect of like, this movie has a lot to say, but it says too little in the end. Like, it gets all kind of mumbled. It's like a bunch of thoughts have been spilled out on the table in front of me. But here we are kind of parsing through them and finding, it's a shame Eli's not here, because usually this is the part of the show where we try to convince Eli that these movies are secretly good.
Yeah, but none of us are convinced it's secretly good. Like, we're finding the diamonds in the rough.
Yeah.
Here,
Definitely.
sure. Yeah.
I mean, Oliver Stone's not like a schlong, he's no who do I want to throw under the table? I don't know, Brett Ratner. He's no insert name of second-rate director right here. He's not a journeyman guy. He's definitely like an auteur if you buy into that kind of stuff. But sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he spent his own money on this movie. Like, this was his passion project, right?
Yeah.
So like,
he made 4 cuts of it over like a 10-year period.
Yeah, and a lot of those were actually in response to some of the criticism that people had about, the film that was released in theaters. And that's why I think I'm trying to find some of those diamonds in the rough, is because I think that he really felt strongly about this version of Alexander. And so we have to try at least to give it, a little bit of credit, or try to read it in the way that he was hoping that we would.
Yeah.
Even if it's not that entertaining and there's problems with it. But I think what ultimately comes out is that it's really hard to make a movie about Alexander the Great. It's hard to make a docudrama. It's hard to write a book. It's hard to do anything, about Alexander the Great, because he is complicated. He did a lot. There are a lot of questions.
It's contradictory, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In this film's defense, like, I would rather have an ambitious swing that misses, right, than a serviceable, boring movie. I'm trying to think of another movie to throw under the bus right now, but at least the ambitious misses are like, they give you something to talk about, which is why like I go to town for the Matrix sequels, because while they're not the most successful movies, I think there's a lot of really cool ideas in there that people sleep on. So maybe I am talking myself around into liking this movie.
Okay.
At least conceptually.
I think it's like, you have to take small parts of it, because when you can take small parts out of it and like contextualize it, like as a jumping point off in a classroom or something, there are points in this film I would show in class and then have a discussion about it. I wouldn't try to make my class sit through 3.5 hours of it, but
maybe it just came at the wrong time. Like, it was a victim of, it came out in 2004 where people were looking for the next Gladiator. And then, that was going to be the ticket. But really, it should have waited until 2008 or 2012 when HBO or Netflix is ready to throw a bunch of money at Oliver Stone to make his.
That's what I think. It would have to be
Alexander.
Serialized. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, like, HBO's Rome was fantastic. I loved that. I think that would have been a great venue for something like this.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was just going to go throw back to what you said earlier about having the subtitles on, because I usually do that now anymore, just to make my life easier for anything I'm watching.
I can't hear without my subtitles.
Exactly, yes. And one of my favorite moments in the movie is his death scene, because he's just kind of mumbling incoherently at that point.
Yeah.
And they make a point of not saying anything, or like they don't put down anything about what he might have said, but you see subtitled what like other people think they heard him say. And I'm like, that was so perfectly done. And that was a great choice for subtitles, because it could claim knowledge of like, well, this is what Alexander really said. But then people misheard him. But it's like, nope, nobody knows what he actually said in that moment. So
yeah, I mean, like, kind of just like to what Jen said a minute ago about, right, trying to make a film or a TV show about Alexander is maybe an impossible task, and we should stop trying, like, conquering Asia or something, right? That it's like, you can't do it. It's too big. It swallows you up. Like, there's just, you get lost in the weeds, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I think there's something to be, there's a nice metaphor here, right? Because ultimately we find out that Alexander was the only individual who could do what he did, right? His empire gets split up into a whole bunch of different parts at the end. Nobody ultimately can do what he did. And maybe Oliver Stone was trying to be that person that could do what Alexander did, I mean, so we can't fault him for trying. But it's just, it was too hard for people in antiquity to be the next Alexander, and it's too hard for us now.
It's like one of my favorite movies to think about in this way is Werner Herzog's Fitzcarraldo, which is the making of the movie is like the movie, where it's like a story about a guy going into the jungle to find riches and wealth and treasure. And it becomes this insane, overblown, crazy production that sucks everybody up, which is exactly what making that movie was like. And I feel like, like Oliver Stone trying to make a movie about a guy who does all this, like, it again, history repeats itself, right? Art imitates life.
I think you're right, though, Colin. I'm glad the film exists, because both this and the Netflix series, I was actually happy to kind of watch them back and forth, because they do inform each other a little bit.
Or like compare this to Troy that we just watched, which has the opposite problem, right? Yeah. It's too basic, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Well, my thought is, and it's like both of these had such a strong reaction of people coming out and saying it's wrong. What do you mean it's wrong? What do you know about Alexander, supposedly, that we all don't know?
Let me take out my Alexander fanfic book where I've drawn myself and he just happens to look like me, but with, an 8-pack, and here he is backflipping across the Hindu Kush.
Right? Like, it wouldn't have had such huge backlash if his name wasn't so well known. And the question is, like, what do so many people know about him or think they know about him? And sure, we make people upset with these movies, with this docuseries, but at the same time, they're upset because their idea of Alexander is being challenged. Mm-hmm. And that's probably a good thing, because I watch these and I'm like, yeah, there's always going to be liberties taken with the story to tell it a certain way. But like, I noticed that there was one quote in both of them,
Statira?
Yeah, the princess.
Statira, both in the docuseries and in the film, when she first meets Alexander, she assumes it's Hephaestion's Alexander. Mm-hmm. And Alexander is quoted saying, it's like, no, you're right. He's Alexander too, basically. And that was used in both. And I don't know if that's because that's what the film did, or if that's actually somewhere in the written sources.
It is.
The initial interaction is. And so now you have two pieces of fairly modern media informing us about this particular moment. And if it wasn't for the docuseries, I wouldn't remember her name or recount how important she was, or that she had a role in the events that took place in Alexander's life. Because otherwise, again, it's all Gordian knot and Gaugamela. So
yeah, I mean, Robin Lane Fox did a great job as a historical advisor on this film. I mean, you can really see him coming out in these conversations. I mean, I can see him insisting, that these certain dialogues have to take place in order for it to be historically accurate, that this relationship, for instance, with Parmenion has to be represented in this way in order for it to be historically accurate. I really do feel like, in terms of what we know from the sources, I can't say fact or fiction, because whatever the sources are telling us is really just all we have. Robin Lane Fox seemed to have been very keen to be sure that we were as close to the sources as possible in this film. So I give him a lot of credit for that. I recognized a lot of anecdotes from the sources, both the so-called official and the so-called Vulgate tradition. And for that, the historical accuracy was not bad in this movie at all. So if you want to, supplement your students with something, that might not be quite as dry as Aryan, then, it's not a bad place to go. But again, it's just for the second half of the campaign. And, you said, that people in different time periods have their own sort of Alexander, and that this was very sensitive to the time period in which it came out. I mean, Alexander is so fascinating because he changes so much depending on what era of history you're in. So, the Romans think this guy is just the best. He doesn't even become Alexander the Great until the Roman era, actually. And then, you know, there's this really interesting reinterpretation of him during World War II. So, like, all the German historians who are writing on Alexander have this totally different take now than we do today. So, like, he really does sort of morph into his own person in different eras of history just to sort of suit the particular political period. And it's fascinating to watch that happen. I mean, you can really trace that with this particular individual through all kinds of media. So
mythic in that way, right? He's like he is like Hercules or Achilles in that way, who like is very much the same way, right? Are they the the ideal masculine elite warrior king, or are they war criminals or tragic figures or case studies in X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I mean, he can be all of those things at any given time. So I don't know. I just think that Stone was really keen on hanging on to this unity of mankind idea, which was kind of in vogue in like the late 40s in Alexander scholarship. And then more contemporary scholars were like, he wasn't really into that. We don't have any evidence for that. And I don't know. Maybe he was into that. I mean, it's just one of those things that we can't know. So it's not a bad message, certainly, especially in the time period that the movie's coming out in.
I think it's interesting that we have we should get to the elephant in the room, perhaps, which isn't an elephant, but it's Angelina Jolie. Who was probably, I think, one of the elements of this movie that people really wheeled against it.
And I love her so much in this era, but not in this movie. She's like, most archaeologists have Indiana Jones. No, I had Angelina Jolie as Tomb Raider, and I loved her in that role. So this one is just so weird, and it's like all of the snakes all of the time, and I like snakes, but
there's something to the snakes, or is that a Plutarch thing or something like that? That somebody.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the whole Angelina, or sorry, not Angelina. I really think of Olympias like Angelina, like she is in my head that way. That's the whole sort of Dionysus worship stuff. I can't figure out, because I don't hate on Angelina Jolie. I think she is usually cast very well for the roles that she's in. This one, I guess I sort of felt like she was maybe overacting.
That's what it felt like.
I wonder if was everybody on the same page of what movie they were in, because it seems like she was kind of in a different movie than everybody else.
She felt like she was in a fantasy and she was the evil queen, but she was owning it.
Yeah, she was the wicked witch or something.
Yeah, and that wasn't necessarily the tone you wanted her to have.
Well, I think even just the accent. If she would have just toned down the accent, it might have made a lot of difference,
Yeah, because there's this whole element. I remember Eli and I talking about this, back in the day, of like the repeated emphasis, in that she's a barbarian, although they're very vague about what that is. But like in real life, she was from Epirus, right? She was from just like a different part of Greece, and any, like they really played up her exoticism in a way that was a choice.
I mean, to some extent. Philip married her, and whether it was for love or not, we don't know, but it was for political alliance. So to some extent she had her place, as a pawn, but I don't think that she needed to be barbarized for us to get that point across too. I mean, but I think the whole idea was to play up, the mommy issue, and also to provide some background for Alexander's belief that he was divine. I mean, maybe this was a convenient way to sort of skip the Siwa episode, is just to sort of rely on Olympias to do that for us. But yeah, I mean, it was just overacted. It was just too much. But maybe it was meant to be, because it was too much for Alexander. That's clear.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's somehow hard to imagine the viciousness that she has for Philip and like surviving it for so long as depicted in the film, because like there's a lot going on in the court of Philip, and if you get on somebody's wrong side, you're not sticking around for very long. So it's kind of and they give allusion to the idea that, she might have had a hand in Philip's assassination, but they give no indication of, like, she seems so isolated, and like her whole fixation is Alexander. You have no true sense of like what power does she actually hold within the court itself, because it can't just be through Alexander for her to survive. And I think that's part of my disbelief of her as a character. It's like there's got to be more to her than just
she's just like leering from high tower windows kind of at all times. That's just like, why would this person be allowed to hang around like this?
Yeah, I mean, they make allusions a couple of times to the fact that even though he treats her so poorly, she still loves him.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's the idea that there is love, a mutual love or reciprocal love under there somewhere. But that would definitely be making too much of the sources if that's where that was intended to go.
I feel like if I want to better understand a court with multiple wives or concubines, I would have to start watching one of those TLC specials like Sister Wives or something, and just see it's like, maybe we should actually use that as like an anthropological study to understand of like what these relationships between these women might actually look like in these setups, and then go from there. Because maybe that would make it more realistic, because yeah, you're going to have infighting, but there's some level of collaboration that has to happen as well in order to navigate it. And that's just it. It's like ancient Macedonia is fascinating to begin with. You can do so much with that. And I think that's, you can understand why Alexander sucks up all the oxygen of that history, that particular history. Like, yeah, it's totally understandable, but there's so much fascinating of like, how do you get an Alexander though? What leads up to it beyond just mommy and daddy
movie's
issues?
Thesis is you traumatize the kid enough and then and teach him bad examples of love, and then let that stew for 16 years, and then
and mythology.
Yes,
and mythology.
Yes. A heavy cocktail of trauma.
You know what?
And
you teach them the classics. You teach them the classics is what.
It's all in there.
Yeah,
it's
give them a classical education, and you too shall conquer the world.
Just a little Oedipus, and you're all good.
So I think this feels like we're kind of approaching a good time. I have a final question for people, but before that, I wanted to see if there's anything that anyone wanted to get out, or if there's something you wanted to say about this movie but haven't gotten a word in edgewise.
No, I think I'm good.
I don't think so.
So I think kind of on that note of like all the different sort of direction of taking, if you were to pitch or propose or write an Alexander project, we'll say, keep it loose, right? What would you want to see, right? What would you want to focus on? What would you want to sort of, what would the parameters be?
Oh boy. Well, I tend to think, and I think actually that Stone got to this a little bit, but maybe not as much as I would have. I tend to think that Alexander was so exceptional in so many ways that he was actually quite lonely. And I don't know that we get a lot of that because he's always surrounded by people, and because Stone focuses on the relationships so much, but they're also superficial. And you can tell that Alexander is never really fulfilled by the conversations that he has with people. So I think, something that might enhance this idea of the loneliness of power or the loneliness of his ambition, I would probably want to sort of underline that a little bit more.
Besides my young Alexander proposal, like Battle of Heronia and all of that stuff, what I liked about the Netflix series was that it was incorporating a lot more of the Persian perspective of things, even though like we don't necessarily have the sources for that. But then it could be really fun to lean into, all right, yeah, let us create a kind of fantasy of Alexander from an outsider perspective. So like, what is Persia? What is Darius really thinking about this boy? And just as the rumors start to accrue and you get this larger of life figure, and then you finally meet him on battle. And that could be a good way to end it too, is ending with the Battle of Gaugamela instead of starting with it.
Mm-hmm.
And you end up coming across thinking of Alexander as a myth more than a real person. So maybe removing, I don't know, it could be an interesting approach to like remove the aspect of the person altogether and make him a god, so to speak, or a mythological figure.
What do you got, Colin?
I got two thoughts. So one is kind of taking a page out of, I don't know if either of you have seen, there's a 2007 film called Mongol that's about Genghis Khan, but it's really about his early life. Like it starts with his childhood and it's really focusing on his relationship with his best friend, then turned enemy. It starts with like him growing up, meeting his best friend, how they're falling out. And then it ends with his sort of first major battle victory where he basically unifies the Mongol tribes. And then it ends right there, right? Because Genghis Khan, I think similarly, right? Like there's a gajillion and one things you could be saying about this guy. And I would almost like think you could do, and that's like not a short movie, right? I want to say it's about 3 hours at least. But you could do something like that, like really kind of like to what Christy was saying, right? Young Alexander start with his growing up with these people, with
The
Aristotle.
companions. Like,
yeah, the companions.
That'd be such a good title too, The Companions.
The companions, right? And then it really, and it ends right with them getting, and another thing with Mongol is like that first battle, it actually basically cuts off most of the battle. Like you just kind of get the sense like, oh, he's going to win now, and doing something like that and really ending it there. Then also you can leave the door open for sequels if the movie's a hit. But the other thought I had was kind of something of like, kind of similar to what Christy was saying, is like the trick to an Alexander movie is to not make it about Alexander. And then to instead focus on somebody peripheral to him. I was thinking Ptolemy, because we know he's going to eventually have a sort of longer life that he can reflect back on. And the other guys get way too Game of Thronesy and convoluted and murdered and usurped and all sorts of stuff. And, really just be like Ptolemy is our main character and just following him. Like, what's it like to be a general and, to be there with Alexander, catching the light off this guy or whatever it is. And then similarly, like, it's like Jesus in Ben-Hur, where it's like you never really see him or something like that. Like he's there, but you never really like he's never quite in focus, because that's really what Alexander is, right? In history, he's like a silhouette or he's never fully in focus. And I think maybe he never should be, because even if you could go back in time and meet the real Alexander, the one thing I'm certain of is that he would probably be disappointing. He'd probably just like be a subdued, right? And like whatever you imagine, there's no way it's going to be him.
I think along those lines, you could also do like a Pat Barker with Silence of the Girls and have Roxana.
Yeah.
That could be really good. Of like,
what's it like to be his third wife, or to be Statira or something like that.
And especially as you start to hear, the rumors of like this new person.
I mean, Statira, right? It's like, her dad is effectively killed by this guy. And then he comes and then.
You should watch the Netflix special. She's much more prominent in that, which I appreciated. So.
I will do that then.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of has me thinking that maybe a cool way to do it would be to have the people in the places that Alexander either besieges or passes through in the Near East. I mean, imagine if you were a native Tyrian, for instance.
Yes, I was just about
to say.
Wouldn't that be cool? Like just to see the siege from, their perspective.
I find it so interesting that no one, like Netflix and this one, is like, don't do it. I'm like,
for context for readers, this is when he gets to the city of Tyre and it's like an island. So the way he conquers it, he just builds a bridge to the island, and then which is still there to this day, right?
Yeah. I mean, he throws an adult temper tantrum because they won't let him sacrifice to the Tyrian Hercules. And so he, spends months building, a mole to get his siege engines over there. But I can just imagine, and then he kills everybody inside, so it would be a really interesting, perspective to see it from their point of view. Or, from the priests at the Oracle at Siwa, for instance, or, the native people in Gordian when he comes and cuts the knot. There are tons of opportunities for stuff like that. So that might even be interesting just to see how, like the inhabitants of Babylon, when he comes in, there's lots of good moments where we could potentially get the perspective from the people that he's, subduing or conquering or just interacting with.
A movie I think about a lot when I watch these historical epics is right around this time, but Master and Commander, which I hold up as kind of the like historical epic par excellence, because it does, like, it's not about Napoleon, right? Or it's in the Napoleonic Wars. The story is made up, but it's very sort of carefully sort of researched, and it's very sort of true to life, even though all the people are made up. But at the end of the day, I think one of the things that makes that movie successful is that it's just a story about a boat trying to find another boat. The simpler the premise of the movie, the more effective the movie usually is, right?
Absolutely.
And so to do something like it's just about taking this city, but something like that, right? If like just make it about one. I mean, I feel like Aristotle just saying like it should be about one singular action, continuous to end, and that is how you tell the story, right? None
Yeah.
of this.
Beginning and middle and end. Yeah.
Exactly, right?
I had one final comment that I forgot to mention. It's like I did really appreciate the actual shots of Babylon.
Yes, they're beautiful.
Yes. Yeah, it was that they kept being the juxtaposition of barbarians, and then you see the city, and you're like, please.
Their city kind of puts us to shame.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and they did everything they could to make it representative of how we know it from the sources. You know, I mean, the Ziggurat to Marduk is there, the Ishtar Gate is there. It's just lavish and incredible, just the way that you would think about it from Diodorus or anybody else.
And then you cut back to Macedon, it's just like a bunch of huts and a bunch of kind of crappily painted statues.
We were all just a bunch of sheep herders just a generation ago.
That's right.
Kind of the joke, yeah.
Oh, I also forgot to mention the other thing I might pitch is the surrealist Alexander romance, where it just goes into pure fantasy insanity, where he's with Amazons and monsters, and we just detach ourselves completely from reality and stop even trying to care about it.
This is not a bad idea.
Yeah.
So that brings me, we mentioned sort of Tyre, and then final sort of question I wanted to ask everybody, but is, do you have a favorite Alexander story that you want to get out there?
Yeah, I used to introduce my history class with an image of it's like one of those memes. It's like, who do you think would win? This little upstart Prince King dude or a impenetrable city on an island? And I'm like, who do you guys think wins this one? And then it's like, do you know who this is? And they're like, no. And I'm like, oh boy, do I have a story for you. So that's always been a favorite. And then again, no one's talking about, don't they burn down Persepolis too?
Yep.
Like, are we just ignoring the pure destruction that happened on occasion with these guys?
A grain of salt, but isn't the story that is a sex worker or a courtesan kind of dared them to do it, or was like, I hate this town, and then so they, on a drunken rampage, they were just like, burn it to the ground.
Yeah, I mean, the sources are different for that. They can't decide whether Thias is the impetus or he really wanted to do it anyway or whatever it might be. I mean, I kind of personally like that story about Alexander, which, by the way, could have made it into the film because that would have made sense chronologically.
It gets a name drop at one point, but that's it, I think.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's pretty important, being that that's the capital of the Persian Empire, and they take an awful lot of money from there and Susa. But yeah, I mean, I went to Persepolis, actually, so I got to see it. And it's really fascinating because they have, this is probably my favorite Alexander-related thing, actually. They have, these beautiful, just like horse stone-cut figures. They have, all of this monumental architecture. And they have a gate there that's called the Unfinished Gate. And it was being constructed when Alexander entered the Persian Empire, and they were still going at it before he marched into Persepolis. And so you can just look at it and see, the panic in the native people, the panic in the army, the panic in the royal house when Alexander is approaching. And it's just still there in ruins, but clearly unfinished, as a sort of testament to the fear and just the upheaval that was caused by this invasion. So I really sort of like that piece of material culture that's really sort of a frozen moment in time. So I like to show that to my students because it's rare that I can, because I have a lot of pictures from going to Iran. And I would say too that is probably going to be harder now than it was when I went in 2011. But something that really struck me when I went there was, we drove a bus like 3,000 kilometers throughout the entire country, and you could really imagine the march in that sort of natural landscape and how hard it would have been. I mean, you could really imagine it because a lot of those places are still untouched. There's not a ton of neighborhoods and suburbs and stuff out in some of these areas. I mean, if you go to the Bisitun inscription, I was standing there at the bottom of this mountain, and shepherds were going by with their sheep. I mean, it was really authentic to the ancient experience. So I just really think that helped me sort of understand how difficult this must have been on his soldiers and what ambition, he had to drag them all that way through these territories. So,
Colin, what was your favorite?
I don't think I can top that, so I'm not going to go.
Cop out. All right.
Yeah. I love Bucephalus. Bucephalus is my
I'm
favorite.
all about that horse. Man, that's a good horse.
See, all the stories are at the beginning of the campaign, though.
Mm-hmm.
It's before the second half. It's before Stone really even started.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking it's like that horse would be pretty old
by the time we
got to India.
He did die in right around that battle, I think.
Yeah. I always joked Alexander finally went home because his horse died, but the true relationship in his life was that horse.
Maybe it really was.
As shown in the film.
I was about to say Barbie really hit the nail right on the head. Where like I got a lot listened to patriarchy when I found out it wasn't about horses. So in that case, I think we're gonna call it there. Christy, do you want to do the sign off, or should I do it?
Do you have it up? Because I realized I didn't.
I always ad-lib it, but I'm happy to do it. Mm-hmm.
Go for it.
Okay. Jenn, thank you so much for coming on the show. We hope you had a good time. But if listeners want to hear or read or see more from you, where can they do that?
Yeah. So I am on the editorial board for Burroughs Companions to Ancient Mediterranean Warfare, and we are pumping those out pretty quickly. So there's a couple new ones coming out. I have a contribution in one that's forthcoming on ancient Iran and warfare in ancient Iran, and also Alexander and his campaigns. So there are lots of good things coming out. I think we just released the 7th, 8th, and 9th of those. So those are really good resources for military historians and people interested in military history. Besides that, there are a couple of things coming out in various journals. I'm working on a book, but I don't know if it's ever going to get done. So maybe I'll wait to plug that until another time. We can revisit Alexander again 10 years from now.
Yes.
And I may have finished it by then. But yeah, I would say that, those Burroughs Companions are pretty fun achievements. So people can have a look out for those.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again, listeners. As usual, you can find us on movieswithdig.com, listen to us on most major streaming services, and you can find us on social media at some variation of @DigMovies. Jenn, thank you again once more. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we'll see everybody around. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.